So I'm pleased that we have here with us today Dr. Anna Porzecanski, Director of the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Anna is a conservation and evolutionary biologist with a PhD from Columbia University. One of the wonderful things about this interdisciplinary, integrative conservation and sustainability work that we're doing here is that everybody comes into it with a background and a story. As I understand it, Anna's research origins are in birds, specifically arid land birds. And there's always a great feeling of gathering when people with their different specialties come together to make integrative music here. But she works today in her role with the center at the museum in conservation, kind of train the trainer and educate the educator functions, and in organizing education across Latin America and Africa and the United States. And so we're very pleased to welcome here Dr. Anna Porzecanski. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Fred, for that super gracious introduction. How's the sound? Can you all hear me? Yeah? A little louder? Okay. Now, if it's too loud, you'll let me know. You'll be. If I see some people going like that, I'll know. Great. So, good morning. I'm so honored and delighted to be here today. So thrilled to finally be visiting the Land Institute 20 years after I read New Roots for Agriculture. And it's so inspiring. The conversations around carbon, culture, change have been illuminating and inspiring. And I'd like to talk to you today. I'd like to add another C-letter word to the conversation, connection. And there are many reasons why I picked this word and this idea. First, connection is how I came to be on this stage today. And I want to tell you that story. Second, connection is at the core of the work we do at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation, and I want to tell you a little bit about that too. And finally, connection is what gives me hope and what I think can sustain us as we do the important work we're all doing. So, how did I come to be here today? Well, the story starts in South America, in the grasslands and agricultural fields of Brazil and Uruguay, where my father, an agronomist, studied grasses like switchgrass and meadowgrass and how to best manage them for cattle grazing. So as a kid, I was often climbing trees, walking fields of sugarcane, of sorghum, of wheat, picking up stones, looking for fossils in the riverbanks. That was my mother's fault, actually. And during the holidays, spending many hours by the ocean. And that allowed me to grow very connected to the land around me, to life on Earth, to biodiversity. How do you feel connected to land and to biodiversity? It's like a big concept, right? Now, something must have popped in your mind. And if you'll indulge me, I also want to do a little bit of conversation between you, a little bit of connecting to one another. And so for those who feel like it, I'm going to give you a minute to share what popped in your mind with one of your neighbors and hear what they will tell you as well. So what connects you to biodiversity? And when I'm going to give you a minute to do this, and when we're done, I've borrowed Rachel's chimes. I'm going to do a little chime. Okay? And you'll know it's time to come back. Okay, so pick somebody and share your connection. This is always the challenge when you do active teaching and learning, is getting the class back together. So let me tell you I told you about my connection, so I hope you learned something new about your neighbor. My connection to biodiversity inspired a lifetime of curiosity. I pursued a biology degree and then further graduate studies, which brought me to the United States 23 years ago. And that was possible thanks to the vision and generosity of Strawn and Vivian Donnelly. They supported the establishment of a new initiative at the museum, and specifically at the center, an international graduate student fellowship program, of which I was a fortunate recipient. They believed in investing in the conservation community and in those who could be its future leaders. And 23 years later, I lead the center as its director. So that's for them. That's really for them. By connecting me to a graduate education and the museum, Strawn and Vivian changed the course of my life. And that's how I come to be on the stage today. We are shaped, we're sustained, quite literally, by these connections we have to other people, even if they're invisible to the eye. So we're going to quickly rush into another round of sharing. Which connections sustain you? Some may be obvious, some not so much. So again, for those who feel like it, I'm going to give you a moment to share with one of your neighbors and maybe even acknowledge that connection with someone else and hear about their connection too. So you have a minute. One more time. Who sustains you? Awesome. Thank you for sharing. A very willing crowd. I love it. So, the sad news of Vivian's passing last year prompted me to reflect on her remarkable influence, and I'd like to take another moment to share with you why her vision and support were so critical to the work we do at the center, and how she inspired me personally. Through her engagement with the center and with the museum, where she was a trustee, she enabled many connections. Vivian and Strawn provided generous, unrestricted support to our center's endowment, thereby investing in our financial sustainability and our future resilience. Vivian also made it possible for many young conservationists to work on CBC projects, and a smaller portion of her gift also supported the time of the staff to mentor them so that we could dedicate our time to really building better relationships with them. And when we decided to change our model from a graduate fellowship to an annual conservation conference that reaches hundreds of emerging conservationists every year, Vivian helped us make it happen. She supported our student conservation and conservation science, our student conference in conservation science for several years. And in fact, we're having the 10th just in 3 days in New York City. So Vivian also had an eye for opportunity. She helped us co-organize a number of highly popular public events with the Center for Humans and Nature, another wonderful organization that she was involved with. And it was a series of talks titled Questions for a Resilient Future. These were typically held together with our student conference, so this provided an opportunity for the senior scholars of their center to interact with the junior scholars that were typically at our conference, and it was very rich. And we did that for 4 years. Finally, Vivian's character and values were also a source of support. The museum has many donors, and she truly stood out for her common sense, her kindness, and as Fred mentioned, her grace. It really is a word that applies. She cared deeply about the relationship, the connection between humans and nature, and she was an optimist. She believed we can all make a difference, and she did just that. The CBC is today what it is. The CBC is the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. It is what it is thanks to her and Strawn's support. And they changed what we aspired to do and what we were able to do. And we're very grateful to her. So now let me turn to telling you a little bit about the work we do and why connection is at the core of it. At the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation, we lead a diverse array of programs and projects, all with the aim of what we call it, transforming knowledge into conservation action. In a nutshell, we do 3 things. We connect different strands of knowledge through interdisciplinary research. We connect people and knowledge through our capacity development work. And we connect people and people through our convening activities and events like the conference I just mentioned. So connection is at the core of what we do at the center. Connecting knowledge from different strands, from different sources and perspectives, has led us to approaches to conservation that are deeply collaborative and systems-based. An example that's particularly relevant to the theme of this festival is our work on biocultural approaches to conservation, headed by my colleague and our chief conservation scientist at the center, Dr. Eleanor Sterling. This work is at the forefront of how to approach conservation while recognizing the dynamic connections between people and their environment, between culture and place. Because we live not just within ecosystems, we live also within biocultural systems. Eleanor and collaborators are working with local communities of customary landowners across the Pacific, communities that are facing major challenges such as climate change, population growth, and the influence of international markets. And together, by collaboratively mapping land use over time and how it has changed, by surfacing how their connections to place underpin their well-being and indeed their health, they're finding ways for these communities to monitor and manage their forests and their reefs in culturally meaningful ways, which incidentally can make these efforts also more sustainable in the long term. So when you're able to track, for example, and maintain fish populations in a reef in a way that also supports traditional feasts and traditional meals throughout the year, you're not just keeping the ecosystem healthy and resilient, but you're also keeping your people connected and resilient. When you're finding ways to measure food security that go beyond what people have in their homes at a given time, but also take into account the cultural practices around sharing food from gardens, you're supporting practices that have made these people resilient for millennia, really, for generations, in these very landscapes. And then you can add cutting-edge science, and you can make these things even more powerful by helping them predict where they will need to plant their gardens in future years under climate change models, for example. So these connections between people and place are not well understood and are not typically taken into account in natural resource management and conservation. This work has big implications because it turns out that when you look at the indicators, the benchmarks that global initiatives like the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Sustainable Development Goals are using to measure and incentivize and fund and direct funds towards more sustainable societies, they're often missing these connections between people and place, and sometimes even putting them at risk. So the final piece of the work we're doing in the Pacific is that we're connecting the indigenous peoples and local communities we work with to learn from each other and working with them to provide guidance to national governments that can be then elevated as better benchmarks for the larger process, right? So this work connects culture, traditional ecological knowledge, social and natural science, and art, actually. I'm not going to tell you too much about art today, but I'm happy to tell you more off stage. The work connects local and global scales. And that was just one example from our kind of interdisciplinary research. I don't have time to tell you in more detail about other parts of our work, but we're also there connecting the dots in many ways. For instance, between the rising demand for lithium for batteries and the effects on wetland ecosystems of the high Andes, where a lot of the lithium is found, and the flamingo populations there, just to give you an example. And we're also fostering capacity for conservation around the world and bringing people together in ways to explore really ways that we can sustain biodiversity. And connections are at the core of that work too. That's because we believe that without biodiversity, we cannot really have a healthy, equitable, truly prosperous, and peaceful future. Now, this is something the Land Institute understands very well because they're trying to evolve that very thing, how we relate to the land, such that our management of resources is in line with the roots that we as people are laying down on these landscapes. And I'm going to digress on roots for a moment. So, human roots. The communities and partners that we're learning from in the Pacific have really deep roots to place in the order of thousands of years. I myself come from a family of wandering Jews who have left to a new land in every generation for the last 4. And so I'm sure there's everything in between here. How do you feel rooted or connected to a place? Do you have deep roots? Do you have roots that are just starting to grow? This is going to be your last opportunity to share with your neighbor. Tell them about your roots, and I'll be back in a minute. All right, thank you very much. I should have done an experiment. And measured the volume of conversation in the barn for each of the questions and seeing which one generated more conversation. It's really great. I hope you are starting conversations that you can continue as well. So I would guess that many of you here are probably in the middle between my experience and that of my family and my partners in the Pacific, right? Having laid roots in these lands or nearby lands, maybe hundreds of years ago. But the cultural connections to place are strong and can be strong in all these cases. The environment here, like in the Pacific, has shaped people and livelihoods and indeed culture, and people in turn are shaping the environment. And all of us, Pacific Islanders, Midwest farmers, urban immigrants, want to be working to adapt to our land, to our place, and to this new time when changes are going to be more profound, faster, and perhaps more difficult. All of our roots to place, the deep ones, the not so deep ones, the very shallow ones of the newest newcomers, they all need fertile, willing soil to burrow into, to extend the metaphor. And that means inclusive outdoor spaces, something that I was really sorry Carol and Finney couldn't be here to talk about that, but that's really important because how are you going to create those new roots to place? You don't have inclusive outdoor spaces, as well as patient, observant, kind of wise ways of living on the land. So to conclude, the final reason I wanted to talk about connection is that it is also what gives me hope. I truly believe that connections among ideas, as we've been hearing here, among strands of knowledge, like I told you in our work, connections to each other and to place, are how we're going to move forward from fear, because there's a lot of fear right now. I think some of the resistance to climate action, to perennial agriculture, all of these kind of things that become battles that shouldn't be battles, perhaps, are because people are afraid sometimes that the solutions and the actions we have to take may be worse than the problem, that they will detract from their comfort, their way of life, their profits. They're not, unfortunately. Sometimes people feel threatened by facts that challenge cherished beliefs. So what can we do? We can create spaces where it is safe to engage with those beliefs, with those mindsets, with those views, to question those beliefs through communication by connecting with each other. Now, I'm not a religious person. Eliza last night, she was thinking to me. But when I start to get overwhelmed or things seem truly bleak, I have found it helpful to remember an old Jewish principle or metaphor that the world is like a big tapestry or blanket that is constantly fraying. And while we don't have the responsibility of solving all the problems on our own, we do have a responsibility of mending the fraying in our corner. And sometimes that fraying looks like silence or fear. And so connect to others in your corner. Let's face the facts and the fears head on. And yes, if needed, let's grieve together for the state of things. And let's move forward from fear to courage and action. I think that's a good vision. And I think it's important to visualize that world you want. And I was delighted to see that it's already depicted in this graph here on the bottom, on the side of the barn, where fear will decline over time. That's the red. And action will replace it. That's the green. And that will make much more room for hope and innovation. That's the white. So Aldo Leopold said, the extension of ethics to the land, to biodiversity really, is an evolutionary possibility and an ecological necessity. I think there's a new awareness building that we are truly in the age of interconnectedness with all of its implications, with its blessings and its perils. But the threads of connection run through all of us, and my hope is that these connections are what will allow our culture to evolve. Thank you very much. Questions, right? wherever the mics are.
I went over all the way over. Okay. There's a couple up here.
Okay, hello.
Here and here.
They're checking.
Okay. You mentioned the importance of connection and sense of place.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, with the increasing importance of social media and let's leave it at that for now. If that source of connection is somehow shifting in a way so that the role of local the place being local and the experiential sort of feeling of place is really changing and maybe perhaps, and I hate to put it this way, but dissipating in some way in relation to the sort of universal connection and then disconnection due to the social media.
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on social media. I share some of your concerns, though. I think that, like I said, we're more and more interconnected, and that has blessings and perils. And so it's all about how you use it, right? I'm sure it could, if I knew a little bit more and they came to mind, I could come up with examples of how social media has, fostered more connection locally in many cases, right? Sometimes to the next neighborhood or within a city or organized other aspects. So I think there are challenges there and there are opportunities there. I don't have the oracle, and I think that whatever it is, though, we have to find a way to live with it and use it for good, use it for mending that fraying. That's all I think I can say about that.
Excellent. We have one with a mic up here.
Hello, sir.
Obviously, we have places in the world that are no longer habitable or becoming inhabitable. The Sahel in Africa, perhaps Central America, islands in the Pacific that are going underwater. So we can't solve this problem just by connecting with where we are. A lot of us have to move.
Yes, and that's a very interesting question that many people are facing in the Pacific. Like in the Marshall Islands, for example, the largest community of Marshallese is somewhere in the Midwest right now. Yes, right? I actually don't know, but there might be many Marshallese in Kansas, for all I know. And so the question is, how do you stay Marshallese if you're not in the Marshall Islands? How do you stay Marshallese if the Marshall Islands are not there anymore? And so this is part of what I mean, though, by evolution, right? Culture is dynamic, and maybe they will find other ways to stay connected to their culture, to their Marshallese-ness. And I hope that's the case. And one of the things we're doing, actually, at the museum and with other collaborators, I'm not leading this project, but some of our anthropologists, is bringing them together to talk about this. And bringing them together to talk to people who have suffered through Hurricane Sandy in New York City and talking about some of the commonalities. It's an infinite game. We don't have a solution that will just solve a problem. We just need to continue to figure out how to live on this planet given everything that's happening and hopefully moving in that direction. Any other questions?
Yes. There's one with the mic here.
Yes.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation and your work. I wanted to say I live, study, and work in the Kansas City region with sustainability issues in local government. And as much as I personally dislike this, the reality of sustainability issues in local government is that the decision makers largely look at the bottom line, the economic argument for the initiatives that are being taken. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the quote-unquote like business case for biodiversity conservation.
I had a long conversation with Leonard last night about that. It's challenging. I think I liked what Amory Lovin said, that it's let's focus on outcomes, not on motives. And in the conservation movement, I'm quoting a dear colleague, we've focused for too long on convincing others of the worthiness of our cause, as opposed to reframing problems as joint problems to solve together. And so what would that take to frame the problems as joint problems to solve together? That would be the first thing I would say. And then you have to really consider, the problem not just as an economical, maybe short-term issue, but also a systems issue, a social justice issue, a biodiversity conservation issue. At the same time, unfortunately, sometimes I think an economic case may help. I was telling Leonard that I had to give a tour of the museum to a very prominent Brazilian politician, not the president, but that's a whole other story. We can talk about that if you follow the news. But, I had maybe 5 minutes to talk to him. He's the governor of a state that has a lot of Amazonian forest in it. And so sometimes arguments like that can be helpful to start a conversation, which is, you have an opportunity. Your forests are valuable on many levels and for many people, and I hope you'll consider, sustaining them for the long term. I think it's the best bet, right? So sometimes they're helpful, but we do have concerns in the biology, ecology community that an economic case will never be enough. Because if you care about, filtration of water, well, we could do that in other ways, maybe, and then one day, maybe your wetlands won't be really that valuable for that function. So we have to think about co-benefits of these environments. We have to think about longer timescales. And the other thing is I would encourage you to do some work on what is it that you have in common to reframe the problem as a common issue. Yeah, thank you.
We have two more, and they already have mics. First here, and then one somewhere over here.
Yes, hi.
I'm an 80-year-old Catholic nun, Sister of Providence. We're into connections. I'm also into God. And I want to say, I don't know how many years ago, I founded a nonprofit called Green Connections with Hildegard of Bingham's idea that life is a greening thing. So we're a lot about life, it seems to me. But we're about, how do you put words around is a much more complicated question. So what you were just saying about co-benefits is a great thing, and community is a great thing. A word I, as an 80-year-old, have heard recently, and I don't know how it's used, but I get what it means. Comorbidities or something like that. Somebody like me could die from, I know that, but I guess the young people are just figuring it out. So I said to somebody here, I'd like to apply for an elder in residence sometimes at the Land Institute.
Is there one more?
Okay. I have observed a trend in this country around cities. And cities are working, I believe now, and certainly ours is, to bring people in to stop the spread of suburbs and to increase density within the city. I think this is all well and good, but it worries me because I'm concerned that that will divorce the feeling that people have and their connection to the land. In fact, I've seen it happen in other countries, and I'm watching it happen in this country. So I wondered if you had any suggestions. You did make a comment about it's the connections between people and place are often missing from sustainability efforts. And so do you have any suggestions about how we can balance that need to increase density in cities without losing the connection between people and land.
Again, I can give my opinion. My mother is an urban planner, so I have a really deep interest in cities as well. I think, you know, humanity is urbanizing, and there's no question about that. But I think we should reach into a very deep and broad arsenal of options. We should enlist art and environmental history and other, you know, companions in this journey to make those links to place visible, to build those new routes to place, to design cities where you can still have a connection to place. It's not going to be the same as what we heard from Wes Jackson yesterday, right? Growing in a very rural place many decades ago. The world changes, but there are some silver linings to cities too, right? In the sense that when you're in a city, resource use goes down. You can actually impact people's consumption much. You have more control on a dial on, you know, what kind of resources they're consuming. Waste can be more, you know, organized, etc. So I think it's a question again of balancing all those pluses and minuses, and also recognizing that some things are changing. I think, yeah.